This is the Alexandria. Not a ship, but a car. A 1967 masterpiece. To its owner, billionaire tech visionary Alistair Vance, it's not a trophy. It's the only remaining touchstone to a childhood he'd rather forget, but can't afford to lose. And now it's dead, silenced by a problem that defies every diagnostic tool, every genius engineer money can hire. They've tried everything. Sensors, software, supercomputers. They've failed. Alistair is facing the one problem his fortune can't solve. Everyone is telling him it's impossible. But what happens when the one person who always believed he was capable of the impossible shows up unannounced? Get ready for a story that isn't about fixing a car, but about rebuilding a soul. The unfixable machine. The garage was a cathedral of modern engineering, a vast, climate-controlled space where light gleamed off spotless white epoxy floors. In the center, raised on a hydraulic lift like a sacred relic on an altar, was the patient. A 1967 Chevrolet Impala, a sleek, two-door hardtop painted a deep, resonant midnight blue. To Alistair Vance, this was not merely a car. It was the Alexandria, the last and greatest library of his past. And it was dying. Around it, a team of the world's best automotive surgeons, dressed in pristine, monogrammed coveralls, moved with a hushed, defeated reverence. Their tools were not wrenches and screwdrivers, but tablets displaying cascading lines of code, diagnostic computers with blinking lights, and sensor arrays that whispered data into headphones. They had tried everything. For 3 days, they had poured their collective genius into machine, and for 3 days, the Impala had answered with nothing but a stubborn, silent refusal to turn over. Alistair stood apart from them, his silhouette sharp against the bright lights. At 42, he was the undisputed king of the tech world, a man who had built a billion-dollar empire from a childhood dream. But here, in this garage that smelled of ozone and futility, he was just a boy again, watching something precious slip through his fingers. His tailored suit jacket was draped over a rolling chair. His tie was loosened, and his usually impeccable hair was disheveled from repeatedly running his hands through it in frustration. The chief engineer, a man named David whose confidence had been steadily eroding all week, approached him, a tablet held like a shield against his chest. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice strained. "We've run the full diagnostic suite again, for the 5th time. The ECU, the engine's computer, it's not responding to any of our recalibration attempts. It's rejecting the new firmware. The sensors are feeding back data that's physically impossible. It's like the car doesn't want to run." Alistair didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the car's graceful, sweeping lines. It was the last thing he touched. Alistair whispered, the words so quiet they were almost lost in the hum of the ventilation system. A memory, fragile and faded, flickered behind his eyes. Not of the sterile palace, but of a cramped, dusty garage that smelled of oil and old wood. A younger man with an easy smile and kind, grease-stained hands was pointing to the engine of the same Impala. 8-year-old Alistair, perched on a wobbly workbench, watched mesmerized. His father's laugh was a warm, solid thing that filled the small space. That was the last weekend. The last good memory before his father walked out, leaving behind a void of silence and unanswered questions. His mother had worked herself to the bone to keep them afloat, and the void had been filled by one person. The sudden, low groan of the main garage door mechanism interrupted his thoughts. The entire team flinched, turning towards the source of the intrusion. Who could be coming in? The security was impenetrable. The door rose steadily, revealing the bright, ordinary daylight of the outside world, and in its frame stood a silhouette that seemed entirely out of place. As the figure stepped into the light, she resolved into a woman in her late 70s. She was stout and sturdy, with a head of soft, white hair pinned neatly into a bun. She wore a simple beige wool coat and carried a large, worn tapestry bag that seemed heavy on her arm. Her eyes, a sharp, intelligent blue, scanned the overwhelming scene before her, bypassing the stunned mechanics and finding Alistair immediately. A gentle, knowing smile touched her lips. David moved to intercept her. "Ma'am, you can't be in here. This is a highly restricted, secure area. How did you even get past the gate?" She ignored him completely. Her gaze locked on Alistair. Her voice, when she spoke, was warm and melodic, laced with a gentle humor, that seemed to soften the hard edges of the room. "Alistair James Vance. I had a feeling you'd be needing me." Alistair turned slowly. The CEO mask, the persona of the unflappable billionaire, started to slide into place, but it crumbled the moment he truly saw her. "Nanny L?" he breathed, his voice laced with a disbelief that was pure childhood wonder. "What are you? How did you—" Eleanor Pettigrew chuckled softly, a sound like pages turning in a well-loved book. "That nice young man at the intercom. I told him I was here to see my boy. He assumed I meant the car." She nodded toward the Impala. "Now, are you going to let me have a look at her, or are you to stand there with your mouth open like a landed fish?" She walked right past the gaping chief engineer, her sensible shoes making soft clicks on the glossy floor. She set her heavy bag down with a definitive thud that echoed in the silent garage. She peered into the engine bay, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she took in the complex web of modern wiring and sensors that had been grafted onto the classic engine. All these wires, like a bowl of techno spaghetti, she muttered to herself. The heart of it is still the same, though. Then she did the unthinkable. She unzipped her bag and reached inside. The mechanics leaned forward, perhaps expecting some kind of advanced, miniature diagnostic tool. Instead, she pulled out an old, battered metal toolbox, its red paint faded and chipped, stained with decades of oil. She clicked the latches open with a familiar, practiced flick of her thumbs. The sound was shockingly loud. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was a set of perfectly maintained, entirely manual tools. She selected a long, well-oiled ratchet wrench. "Sir," David protested, his professional pride overriding his shock. "With all due respect, we cannot let a civilian tamper with this vehicle. The systems are too delicate. One wrong touch could—" Alistair held up a hand, his eyes never leaving Eleanor. He was watching her, a flood of memories washing over him. This was a woman who had fixed his broken bicycle chain, who had brought their ancient toaster back to life with a single well-placed smack, who had somehow always understood the mysterious inner workings of the world. He remembered the absolute faith he had in her capable hands. "Stand down," Alistair said, his voice quiet, but leaving no room for argument. He took a step closer to her, his voice softening. "Nanny L, what are you going to do?" Eleanor didn't look up from the engine. She gently placed the socket onto a bolt and gave it a slight turn, not to loosen it, but as if to say hello. "What your fancy machines can't do, dear," she said, her voice soft but clear in the utter silence. "I'm going to listen." The language of silence. The silence of the garage was absolute, a heavy, expectant blanket, smothering the usual hum of technology. For a full minute, no one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was a faint, almost imperceptible rustle of Eleanor's wool coat as she shifted her weight, her ear still pressed firmly against the engine block of the Impala. To the team of engineers, it was an absurd, almost primitive spectacle. They were masters of a digital universe. And here was this elderly woman, listening to metal as if it could speak. David, the chief engineer, could barely contain his professional horror. He shot a desperate, pleading look at Alistair, who stood transfixed, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Alistair's gaze wasn't on the car. It was on Nanny L's face. He saw the deep concentration there, the slight furrow of her brow, the way her eyes moved rapidly behind closed lids as if she were translating a complex, silent language only she could hear. He was transported back to their small kitchen, watching her diagnose a malfunctioning radio by simply tapping its wooden casing. She had always operated on a different frequency, one of intuition and tactile sense, a world away from the cold logic of binary code. Finally, Eleanor straightened up with a soft grunt. She patted the fender of the Impala affectionately, as if comforting a spooked animal. "Well," the word burst from David, sharper than he intended. "What did you hear?" Eleanor turned her calm blue eyes on him, not with annoyance, but with a patience that seemed infinite. "She's scared," Eleanor stated simply, as if it were the most obvious diagnosis in the world. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the team. One of the younger engineers failed to stifle a disbelieving snort. David's face flushed. "Scared? With all due respect, ma'am, it's a machine. A collection of metal, rubber, and silicon. It doesn't have emotions. It has error codes. Eleanor's smile was gentle but held a core of unshakable certainty. She picked up a clean rag from her toolbox and began to slowly wipe her hands. You've been shouting at her in a language she doesn't understand, poking her with your electric sticks. No wonder she's clammed up. She turned to Alistair. You transplanted her brain. Alistair. You took out her simple, honest heart and replaced it with that thing. She pointed a dismissive finger at the sleek new engine control unit mounted near the firewall, a nest of multicolored wires sprouting from it. Alistair felt a defensive flash of pride. It's a Vance Hyperflux ECU. It regulates fuel injection, ignition timing, valve lift. It makes her more efficient, more powerful, more responsive than she ever was. He sounded like he was reciting a product brochure, even to his own ears. It gives her a nervous breakdown, Eleanor countered softly. She doesn't know how to be all those things. She only knows how to be what she is, what your father made her to be. She let the words hang in the air. The mention of his father was a punch to Alistair's gut, a reminder of why this car was so sacred and why its failure felt so much like a personal betrayal. He looked from the anxious faces of his highly paid team to the serene certainty on Nanny L's face. A war raged within him, the pragmatic futurist against the sentimental boy. The futurist knew this was madness. The boy remembered her fixing his world with a screwdriver and a song. What do you need to do? Alistair asked, his voice quieter now, making a choice. Eleanor's eyes twinkled. I need you to tell your gentlemen to take the rest of the day off. They're making her nervous, hovering like a flock of worried crows. David looked apoplectic. Mr. Vance, you can't be serious. The proprietary systems alone, the liability. David, Alistair interrupted, his tone leaving no room for debate. The team is dismissed for today, with full pay. Thank you for your efforts. The dismissal was a shockwave. The engineers exchanged stunned glances, slowly placing their tablets on workbenches and shuffling out of the garage with backward, disbelieving looks. David was the last to leave, his shoulders slumped in defeat. When the massive door hissed shut, the garage felt different. Smaller, more intimate. It was just the two of them in the silent blue car. Eleanor moved back to her toolbox. Now we can get to work. First, we need to quiet all this noise. She reached in and pulled out what looked like a set of ordinary combination wrenches. But then she also pulled out a small vintage AM/FM radio. Its fold with grains scratched and faded. She plugged it into a nearby outlet and tuned the dial. Static crackled, then resolved into the warm, low sound of a classical music station, a Brahms symphony filling the vast space. Alistair watched, utterly bewildered. Nanny L, what is all this? You can't listen if there's too much noise, dear. And I'm not just talking about the sound. It's the noise in here. She tapped her own temple. And in here. She gently placed a hand on the car's fender. The music helps. It soothes the beast. She handed him a wrench. Here, you'll need this. Alistair stared at the cold, familiar weight of the steel tool in his manicured hand. He hadn't held a real wrench in 20 years. It felt foreign, and yet strangely comforting. What am I supposed to do with this? He asked, the tech billionaire utterly lost. You're going to help me give her her old heart back, Eleanor said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We're going to take that computer out and put the original carburetor and distributor back in, the one your father rebuilt. Alistair's breath caught in his throat. He looked at the Hyperflux ECU, the pinnacle of his company's innovation, a device worth more than the car's original value 10 times over. He looked at the simple wrench in his hand. He was about to undo millions in research and development on a hunch from his nanny. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw no doubt, only a quiet, unwavering faith, the same faith she had always had in him. This was the real test. He realized, not of the car, but of him. Could he quiet the noise? Could he listen? Taking a deep breath, Alistair Vance, CEO of Vance Hyperflux Industries, nodded and stepped toward the car. Undoing the future. The warm strains of the Brahms symphony seemed to push back the sterile, cold atmosphere of the garage, creating a bubble of focused calm around the Impala. Alistair stood motionless, the weight of the wrench in his hand feeling both insignificant and immense. He was staring at a Hyperflux ECU, a sleek black module that was a brainchild of his own company, a product of countless all-nighters and billions in R&D. And he was about to dismantle it on the advice of his nanny. Eleanor was already in motion, her movements economical and assured. She rummaged in her tapestry bag and pulled out a smaller, oilcloth bundle. Unrolling on the floor revealed a collection of parts that were ancient history to Alistair's engineers, but to him, they were a direct link to a past he had tried to both honor and surpass. There, nestled in the cloth, was the original Rochester Quadrajet carburetor, its cast-iron body dull but clean. Next to it was a distributor, its cap yellowed with age but its terminals free of corrosion. She had brought his father's parts. He kept them in the basement, you know, Eleanor said softly, following his gaze. In a box labeled for Ollie. He meant to put them back one day. He always said you'd souped it up too much for its own good. The words landed with the force of physical blow. For Ollie, a nickname no one had used since he was a boy. A box from a father he had convinced himself had left without a backward glance. The garage, the car, the music. It all suddenly felt like a seance, conjuring ghosts he'd spent a lifetime building walls against. I improved it, Alistair said, his voice tight. I made it better, more reliable, more efficient. He was defending himself to a ghost, to a memory, to the gentle woman handing him tools. You tried to make it something it's not, Eleanor corrected him, not unkindly. There's a difference, dear. Now, let's start by disconnecting this wonderful, complicated brain of yours. It's giving me a headache just looking at it. She pointed to the main wiring harness. You see that primary connector? The big one with the red clip. That's the first thing to go. But mind the juice. The juice? Alistair asked, slipping back into the role of a student under her tutelage. The battery, Alistair. Always disconnect the negative terminal first. It's the first thing your father ever taught you about cars. Have you forgotten everything? Her tone was chiding but laced with affection. Shame washed over him, hot and sudden. He had forgotten. He'd built an empire on the future, but he'd abandoned the simple, fundamental truths of his past. He moved to the battery, found the correct wrench size from the set she laid out, and with a few turns disconnected the cable. The act felt profoundly symbolic, a literal powering down of his present to reconnect with his past. Working side by side with her was a study in contrasts. His movements were initially hesitant, clumsy, his mind racing to potential consequences, the corporate fallout, the sheer absurdity of it all. Hers were fluid and instinctive. She didn't need schematics. Her hands seemed to know every bolt, every wire, every nuance of the machine. She hummed along to the radio, occasionally offering quiet instructions. Easy now, it's been in there a long time. It might be stubborn. That sensor bracket is just in the way. Dear, you can take it off. Pass me the 9/16, would you? The short one. As they worked, the layers of his modern innovation were stripped away. Bundles of wires were carefully coiled and set aside. The expensive, unnecessary sensor arrays were removed. With each part that came out, the car seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, becoming simpler, more honest. The tension that had been thrumming through Alistair since the car had first failed began to slowly ebb, replaced by the simple, physical satisfaction of manual labor. He found himself watching her hands. They were old hands, lined with veins and spotted with age, but they were strong and capable. They were the hands that had tied his shoes, made his grilled cheese sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, and held his head when he was sick. They were the hands that had held him together when his world fell apart. And now, they were patiently, methodically, putting his world back together again. He was so lost in the rhythm of the work, in the quiet companionship, that the sudden, jarring buzz of his personal phone on the concrete floor made them both jump. The screen lit up with a name, Chloe Vance, his wife. Eleanor paused, a socket driver in her hand, and looked at him. The spell was broken. The real world was intruding, and it was calling from his 12,000-square-foot penthouse overlooking the city. You should get that, she said softly. It might be important. Alistair looked from the phone to the half-removed ECU, to the grease now smudged on his white dress shirt cuff, to Nanny L's patient face. The two worlds were colliding violently. Answering the phone meant explaining the inexplicable. It meant admitting he was in a garage with his childhood nanny, undoing his life's work based on a feeling. It meant re-entering a reality of board meetings and shareholder expectations. The phone buzzed again, insistent, a tiny, angry beacon of his other life. The music on the radio swelled, a dramatic, sweeping crescendo that seemed to mock his indecision. The easy harmony of the last hour shattered, replaced by a crushing weight of responsibility. He looked at the car, at the parts that represented a man he barely remembered. He looked at Eleanor, who represented the only stability he'd ever truly known. Then he looked at the phone, a device that connected him to everything he had built for himself. With a deep breath that did nothing to calm the storm inside him, Alistair Vance reached for his phone. The intrusion. The phone vibrated on the epoxy floor with the aggressive persistence of a trapped hornet. Chloe Vance. The name glowed up at him, a stark reminder of a world that existed beyond this grease-stained bubble. The soaring strings of Brahms felt suddenly ironic, a soundtrack to a moment of profound dissonance. Eleanor had turned back to the distributor, her posture suggesting a deliberate retreat into the task, granting him a semblance of privacy in the vast, echoing space. But there was no privacy from the decision he had to make. Alistair's hand hovered over the device. To answer was to invite the chaos of his present into this fragile reconstruction of his past. To ignore it was to invite a different, more domestic kind of chaos later. With a sigh that felt like it came from the very soles of his shoes, he swiped the screen and raised the phone to his ear. Chloe. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, husky and subdued, lacking its usual CEO crispness. Alistair? Where are you? Your assistant said you never made it to the meeting with the Japanese investors. Is everything all right? Her voice was sharp with concern, laced with an undercurrent of frustration. The meeting. He had completely forgotten. A $7 million deal. Vaporized from his mind the moment Nanny L had walked through the door. He closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. I'm at the garage. With the car. A pause on the other end, pregnant with confusion. The garage? What do you mean you're at the garage? Are the engineers still there? Did they figure it out? No. They're gone. I sent them home. He could feel the absurdity of the words as they left his mouth. You sent them home? Chloe's tone shifted from concern to pure incredulity. Alistair, what is going on? David called Marcus, and Marcus said some elderly woman showed up and you just dismissed the entire team. He said it looked like she was listening to the engine. He could picture her in her pristine kitchen, one hand on her hip, her perfectly styled blonde hair framing a face etched with bewilderment. Chloe lived in a world of curated perfection, of social calendars and public image. This story made no sense in her universe. She's not just some woman, Chloe. It's Nanny L. The name hung in the air, and he knew instantly it would mean little to her. Chloe knew the broad strokes of his difficult childhood, the absent father, the struggling mother, but he'd always glossed over the details, especially the humble, loving presence of Eleanor Pettigrew. She was a footnote he'd never fully explained. You're a nanny? The words were slow, dripping with disbelief. Alistair, is this a joke? Your nanny is fixing a hyperflux engine? Have you lost your mind? The board is already nervous about the delay on the new prototype reveal. If they hear what are you even doing? He looked over at Eleanor, who was patiently labeling a bundle of wires with a piece of masking tape and a marker. She was the picture of serene competence. We're putting the original parts back in, he said, the statement sounding both simple and utterly insane. The line was silent for so long, he thought the call had dropped. You're doing what? The question was a whisper, a blade of pure ice. You are dismantling $1 million of proprietary technology to replace it with what? Junk from the 70s? On the advice of your nanny? It's not junk, he said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. They're the original parts. My father's parts. She says the car, she says it's confused, that the modern computer is overwhelming it. Even as he said it, he heard how it sounded, like madness. Chloe let out a short, humorless laugh. It's a car, Alistair. It's not a therapy patient. It doesn't get confused. It has a malfunction that your team, the best in the world, couldn't fix. The logical conclusion is that it's beyond repair, not that it needs its hand held by a retired babysitter. Her words were logical, reasonable, and they cut him to the quick because a part of him, the part that ran a tech empire, agreed with her. But a deeper, older part, the part that had sat on that workbench watching his father, recoiled. She's not a babysitter, he said, his voice low and firm. She knows what she's doing. What she's doing is jeopardizing your credibility. Chloe's composure was cracking, her voice rising. People are talking, Alistair. David is furious and probably already updating his resume. This isn't just about a car. This is about perception. It's about stability. You're acting erratically and it's scaring people. It's scaring me. The accusation landed heavily. Erratically? It was the worst thing you could call a visionary. Visionaries were supposed to be bold, not erratic. The word implied a loss of control, a crack in the foundation. He saw Eleanor glance his way, a faint line of worry on her forehead. She could hear the tension in his voice, even if she couldn't hear the words. She gave him a small, reassuring smile before turning back to the engine bay. He was straddling two lives, and the chasm between them was widening by the second. On one side was Chloe, his beautiful, ambitious wife, his sleek penthouse, his board of directors, and the relentless forward march of progress. On the other was a rusty toolbox, a classical music radio, an old woman's unwavering faith, and the ghost of a father he never understood. "Chloe, I have to go," he said, his voice tired but final. "Alistair, don't you dare hang up. We need to talk about this. You need to stop whatever this is. Right now, get back in the car, come home, and we'll figure out a PR strategy to explain this lapse." A lapse? That's all this was to her. A bizarre hiccup in an otherwise perfectly managed life. "I can't," he said simply. "Why not?" He looked at the carburetor, waiting to be installed. He looked at Nanny L's steadfast back. "Because she needs me to pass her the wrench," Alistair said quietly. And before his wife could unleash the torrent of frustration he knew was coming, he ended the call. The sudden silence in the garage was deafening. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering onto the floor. He expected to feel guilt, anxiety, panic. Instead, a strange, liberating calm settled over him. He had made a choice. For the first time in a long time, he had chosen the past over the future. Eleanor didn't ask what happened. She simply held out her hand. "Palm up, the 9/16, dear. The long one this time." Alistair picked up the wrench, its weight now feeling familiar and right in his hand, and passed it to her. The outside world could wait. The first turn, the silence after the phone call was profound, but it was no longer heavy with tension. It was a silence of shared purpose. Alistair had drawn a line in the epoxy dust, and he had chosen his side. The world of board meetings and investor calls felt a million miles away, locked outside the giant garage door. Here, there was only the scent of old gasoline, the warm hum of the classical radio, and the steady, reassuring presence of Eleanor Pettigrew. She accepted the wrench from him without a word about the phone call. Her eyes, however, held a deep understanding. She had heard enough, seen enough in his face, to know a battle had just been fought and won. "Right then," she said, her voice businesslike but kind. "Let's get this old heart back where it belongs. Hold this bracket for me. Dear, your fingers are younger and nimbler than mine these days." Alistair moved to obey, fitting his hands into the tight space she indicated. His designer shirt was now irreparably stained, his slacks smudged with grime. He didn't care. For the first time in years, he was using his hands for something other than typing on a keyboard or shaking hands. He was creating, or rather, uncreating and recreating. The physicality of it was a meditation. They worked in a comfortable quiet, the symphony on the radio providing a rhythm for their labor. Eleanor would murmur an instruction, and Alistair would fulfill it, his initial clumsiness giving way to a rediscovered muscle memory. He remembered the feel of a stubborn bolt, the specific torque needed to loosen a frozen nut without shearing it. He remembered the names of parts, the throttle linkage, the fuel line, the vacuum advance, words that had been buried under decades of terms like algorithmic optimization and synergistic integration. As he held the heavy carburetor in place while Eleanor secured it, He spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He was going to put it back? My father? Eleanor didn't stop working, but her movements became slower, more deliberate. Oh, yes. He talked about it all the time. He was so proud of you, Alistair. So terribly proud. But he was also a little heartbroken. Alistair's breath caught. Heartbroken? Why? Because you were so desperate to improve everything, she said softly, connecting a fuel line with a sure twist of her wrist. To make it faster, smarter, better. He saw it as a rejection of what he had made, of what he could provide. He thought you were ashamed of it. Of him. The wrench in Alistair's hand felt suddenly like a lead weight. The memory he had clung to so fiercely, that his father had left because he didn't care, was being gently dismantled and rebuilt. Just like the car. What if his father's departure wasn't an act of abandonment, but of retreat? What if he had left because he felt obsolete in the eyes of his brilliant, forward-charging son? He never said anything, Alistair murmured, the words thick with regret he hadn't anticipated. Men of that generation rarely did. Eleanor replied with a sigh. They bottled it up until the pressure became too much. He loved you, Alistair. He just didn't know how to bridge the gap between his world and the one you were so eager to build. The revelation was a seismic shift in his internal landscape, his entire narrative of his childhood. The foundational pain that had driven him to prove his worth through relentless achievement was being reframed. It wasn't a story of rejection. It was a tragedy of miscommunication and pride. For a while, the only sound was the turning of wrenches and the melancholic swell of a cello from a radio. They finished mounting the carburetor and moved on to the distributor, carefully setting the timing by hand based on marks his father had etched into the metal a lifetime ago. It was a painstaking process, one that required patience and feel. Things no computer could simulate. Finally, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, it was done. The Hyperflux ECU and its tangled web of sensors sat in a lonely, expensive pile on the floor. In its place sat the past, clean and simple and waiting. Eleanor wiped her hands on a rag and nodded toward the battery. Reconnect her, dear. Let's see if we've been listening properly. Alistair's heart began to hammer against his ribs. This was the moment of truth, not for the car, but for him, for his faith in Nanny, for his willingness to believe in a different kind of truth. He walked to the battery, reconnected the cable, and gave it a firm tighten. He slid into the driver's seat of the Impala. The familiar worn leather creaked under him. The interior smelled of old vinyl and wax, a scent that was pure childhood. He glanced at Eleanor, who stood by the fender, her hand resting on the car, her eyes closed as if in prayer. He took a deep breath. This was it. He turned the key. The engine didn't roar to life. It didn't even start immediately. It cranked over once, twice, a low, grinding sound that made his stomach clench. It's not going to work, he thought, a spike of panic piercing his calm. It was all a foolish fantasy. But on the third crank, something changed. The engine sputtered. A cough of life. Then another. And then, with a deep, throaty, rumbling vibration that he felt in his very bones, the Impala roared to life. It wasn't the silent, efficient purr of the Hyperflux system. This was a living, breathing sound, a rhythmic, powerful idol that shook the car gently. It was the sound of his childhood, the sound of his father. Tears, hot and utterly unexpected, welled in Alistair's eyes. He didn't try to stop them. He looked through the windshield at Eleanor. She had opened her eyes, and they were shining with tears of her own. She was smiling, a wide, triumphant smile that smoothed away the lines on her face. She gave the fender two solid, affectionate pats. "The heart wants what it wants, dear," she said, her voice barely audible over the beautiful, rumbling noise. "You just have to be quiet enough to hear it beat." Alistair sat in the driver's seat, letting the vibration of the engine he and his father had built together flow through him, washing away decades of misunderstanding. The car was fixed, and he felt, for the first time in his adult life, that maybe he was too. What did you think of that incredible moment? The past isn't just history. It's a living part of who we are. If the story of connection and rediscovery is resonating with you, please show your support. Subscribe to the channel for more journeys like this. and hit that like button to let us know you want to see what happens next. Your engagement helps us bring these powerful tales of everyday transformation to you.